Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. So today we're going to talk about chapter 18, and I'm going to just generalize really about this time period between 1890 and 1914. There's nothing in this chapter that's, I guess, not important, but there's some things that, I don't know that we really need to know a lot about. So let me kind of frame this chapter up first, maybe starting here in the U.S., because some of you can relate to this. So in this period of time, we're just these masses of immigration into the U.S., and it's because of industrialization and all of the new jobs. So all of the immigrants moving into the country, some of you in this class, maybe your great grandparents perhaps, were amongst those, or your grandparents if you're as old as I am. So my grandfather came from Hungary to Canada, and then from Canada into the U.S. through like Niagara Falls, Buffalo, New York, that region. In the 1890s. So again, pretty typical of the experience of a lot of people. So that's sort of one big thing that was going on in the U.S. And it was going on all over the world, though. There was a lot of movement and there was a lot of immigration between countries. One of the reasons is because transportation was getting better. And if you were my grandfather who lived, out on the steppes in Romania, now you could get to the Atlantic, by train finally. So, mass immigration's happening, a lot of it just because of transportation. A lot of Chinese moving into the western United States to work on the railroads and the mines out west in the 1890s. As a matter of fact, our first immigration reform or our first immigration law was in the 1880s, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that's in this chapter. So that's one of the pieces of evidence we know that if there was a law passed to exclude Chinese immigrants in the 1880s, we know it must have been a problem, and it was because out west there was this big idea that Chinese laborers were taking over American jobs, which were actually Irish workers that wanted those jobs. That's another whole story. So let me get into the chapter a little bit. That frames it up to let you know there's a lot of mass movement going on, and a lot of that mass movement is because of what we talked about in the last chapter, which was this idea of imperialism. So we talked a little bit about the new imperialism. And again, I keep stressing industrialization in here because that's why there's a lot of changes and movement going on. There's jobs opening in the U.S., there's jobs opening in Western Europe because of industrialization. People are moving around. Everything is modernizing. So, the chapter goes through this idea of progress and upheaval and movement. So that's sort of that part. And then this discontent with imperialism. Let me just go through here. So it talks about immigration and some of the stuff I talked about and some pictures of like Tokyo and how crowded it's getting. So the invention of the automobile is coming online, and cities are booming. So all of a sudden there's starting to be, and this is around the world, there's starting to be this real divide between, urban people, city folk and country folk. And I think that still goes on today to some extent, not as much. So that's something else that's happening around the world. And the book talks about urban life and these changing identities. I mean, the U.S., for example, really changed from a rural farming type country to a city country dominated by non-farm jobs around this period of time in the early 1900s. So again, a lot of stuff going on, a great map here about migration of people. So you'll go through that, and let me just get to, here we go, discontent with imperialism. So one of the things I talked about was, all of these colonial empires and all their need for raw materials and oil and England taking over India and all of this stuff that was happening, it's all driven by imperialism. So you're going to read about discontent between people who were colonized and their colonizers. You'll read a little bit about the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa. Interesting, but probably not that important in the big picture. And here's a great map of Africa, and I think this is good to look at because you can see each one of these colors really represents a different Western nation who've colonized these areas. So, no wonder the African people are going to start to rise up against their oppressors. And you can see the book does a great job. You can see these resistance movements all around this same period of time. And part of the reason is because, people are starting to communicate more. Even the workers and the laborers, they're starting to communicate more. They're starting to identify more and get together more. And so as you identify as a group, you tend to rise up against your oppressors. And that's what's happening in this same period of time all around the world, not just in Africa. We'll read about the Boxer Rebellion, and that was in China. So same thing. So there's the Boxer Uprising. So again, this is a peasant uprising against the elite government who's not relating to the people at all. And in this period of time, I mean, there's not modern communications. People aren't on their phones or watching TV, so they don't really know what's going on. But as people get more literate, they start to learn more about what's going on, and all of a sudden there's there's this huge disconnect between the king or the emperor, who is ever in charge, and the people. And that historically works like that all the time with governments, even ours. So the Boxer Rebellion in China, and again, sort of a change from old to new, and sort of the idea of the people taking over. So read about that. Worldwide insecurities. Again, this is mostly about imperialism. The one thing I think that's really important in this chapter to take away, and again, it's not so much the chapter, but the time period around the world between 1890 and 1914, is the fact that the Western world financially is just dominating. So you read a little bit about Rockefeller in here, with Standard Oil. So one of the first guys to really kind of create a monopoly with oil. And so, Andrew Carnegie is really going crazy with steel around this period of time. So, understand that a lot of these rich guys and a lot of the rich banks have a lot more money than most of the countries during this period of time. So the reason I bring it up is because industrialization has a huge impact on people, and it leads to conflicts, because as these big countries want more raw materials and more control, they get into conflicts. And one of the reasons this chapter cuts off at 1914 is because of World War I. So that's one of the conflicts that's going to come out of all these changes going on with people and with empires. So stay tuned as we get into it, that's going on. So now we're going to get into this part of the book, cultural modernism. Part of this, okay, so I don't know how much of this deserves textbook recognition, and the reason I say that is it's not that Picasso isn't important. I love Picasso. I'd love to own a Picasso. I think they're very cool, and I think obviously they're a departure from art that came beforehand, so we should recognize it. But again, you're going to read about Picasso, and then you're going to read about Nietzsche somewhere, and Freud. So let me just get over there. So yeah, Nietzsche and Freud. So, I have a strong opinion on a lot of this stuff. I had to read Nietzsche in grad school, for theory class. Very interesting. All right. Sometimes hard to understand, but very interesting, and very, certainly knowledge is power, and anything we can learn is good. But I don't know how you can apply Nietzsche stuff to the real world. And so I don't know if you know Nietzsche real well, if it's going to help you go get a job or anything like that. So, I don't know, how much Nietzsche's worth, but I think he represents this idea of a flowering of thought and philosophy that's going on. All right. Sort of the tail end of the big enlightenment that's happening in the 18th century. So Nietzsche's in here, and then you'll read about Freud. And again, I think mental health is really important. I think counseling is really important. I encourage you, if you need to talk to someone, that counselors out there are extremely valuable, and they've helped people. They help everybody. All right. But I will criticize Freudian psychoanalysts a little bit, because he was like a lot of people during this period of time that was very much an elitist, and Freudian psychoanalyst was not accessible to the working class at all. So yeah, it deserves to be mentioned, but in the big picture, it's pretty much discounted by a lot of counselors now. Just sort of the sexual longing childhood part of why things happen in your head. Childhood trauma is bad enough. So if you need help, please talk to someone. But I don't know that a Freudian counselor in Vienna is really going to help you out that much. So there are better solutions. Modern mental health care, cultural modernism in China. Again, we talked a little bit about the Boxer Rebellion, but we also see China's modern art. I love this art. I think it's great. So that's cool. Same old thing with race. I think we've been talking about it in the last chapter also. But again, not only are nations starting to identify in this idea of nationalism, but a lot of races and ethnicities are still identifying. And again, it's kind of complicated, but as far as how it applies to this chapter, and the only reason I bring it up, we'll talk about immigration here a little bit, but I just want to flip through. As you flip through the chapter, there's going to be this part of pan movements, okay? And so when we talk about race and ethnicity, hold on one second, I'll go backwards. When we talk about race and ethnicity, you're going to read about these pan movements, and they're important to understand. And I think I'm recording this on November 4th, 2023, and I'll probably reuse this in the spring in 2024. And right now, the Israeli-Hamas war has just started. And I don't know where it'll be when you're watching this in the spring, but again, these pan movements, this idea of pan-Islam, this idea of Zionism, which is the original sort of movement for the Jews to get into Israel in the 1940s, which we'll talk about. These pan movements are going on, and I think they're important. And I skipped ahead in this part of the chapter because I think as we apply what we know today, whether it's war in Ukraine or war in the Middle East or war in China, a lot of times what we see is these wars expand because of this idea of these pan movements that, hey, we're all Christians or we're all Islamic, so we're all Jews or whatever. So we all sort of group together in these large groupings. So I think it's particularly relevant today. We're all Ukrainians instead of, hey, we're Russians, with Ukraine. So I think it's important that we think about these pan movements and how they change and how modern communication and literacy sort of changes pan movements as people learn about who they are and identify as Americans or as Ukrainians or as Israelis or whatever. So important in this chapter. So I hate to go ahead, but I thought it was important to kind of interject that. And I just want to go back a little bit because one of the things we talked about was this pushback from colonialism. And one of the biggies, and hopefully I didn't go too far, but one of the biggies was the formation of the INC. And maybe I did go too far. And the INC was the Indian National Congress in India. And again, it was pushback. All right, it was pushback to English colonization. So if I missed it in this chapter, it's in here. The other thing right here, I mentioned the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. I mentioned that when we opened up the lecture. So there it is, 1882. Again, it's really, that's not only important because it was the first kind of national immigration law in the U.S., but it's also important because it really started to form the U.S. government. And what I mean by that is prior to the Exclusion Act, the government didn't have offices out west and stuff. They had nothing. We were only in Washington, D.C. There was no reason to have a federal FBI out west. It didn't work that way. And there might have been federal marshals, but there wasn't a presence. And because of this Chinese Exclusion Act in 1887, an immigration department had to form, okay, right away. And they had to build some offices out west and places where they could check in immigrants and stuff. So it's really not only indicative of the racial attitudes at the time, but it's also an important part of American history because it's this beginning of this physical American government that has offices around and places where you have to go check in. So pretty interesting there. We read about Darwin in the last chapter and this idea that people applied Darwinism to everything from business to race. That's still happening today. Environmental movements in the U.S., a lot of that had to do with elites. Oh, let's see. Sun Yat sen in China. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Sun Yat sen because China is going to be up for a lot of changes in the next two chapters. So let's just wait until we get to Chiang Kai shek and we get to the Chinese nationalist movement, which is going to be coming up in the next chapter, because Chiang Kai-shek is much more, much more important, or I guess interesting. Here's the Indian National Congress. I talked about that. As far as this, huge colonial pushback, this INC is formed, by a group of Indians, to push back on British colonialism and to try to find a voice for their own country. So interesting to know about that. Again, sort of part of this modernism that's going on, Hindu revivalism, all kind of part of that. The Pan movements we already talked about. Good for us. And let's see. That's about it. A couple of things I just want to mention here. So pardon me. So, it talked about Picasso and it talked about Freud, and I kind of, made light of some of these things. But something else in this period of time it didn't talk about. Let me just go over here. So this is like the Harvard timeline of significant medical discoveries. So look at this period of time, and I think this stuff is far more important, so it should be in the book, but we're going to cover it anyway. So look at this period of time between 1890 and 1914. But, the discovery of appendicitis, I don't have my appendix. Thank God someone discovered it. Discovery of how insects pass along disease, invention of the electrocardiograph, invention of insulin. I mean, there's some kind of big things here. So, keep that in mind as you read these chapters. Sometimes the historians that, put these together are sort of selective about what they pick. And I think these things that are talking about, breakthroughs in medicine. I mean, what about electricity? It does not spend a lot of time on Thomas Edison and sort of the electrification of the world, which I actually wrote a book about. So, it doesn't talk about that. So I just want to bring those things up because the idea of modernity, is a lot more than Picasso and Nietzsche's ideas. It's really sort of the invention of the modern world, that we all know about today. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And let's see, was there anything else I wanted to talk about? No, that was about it. I think I got all of my notes. So you have a primary source exercise this week. Make sure you do it in Inquisitive. If your Inquisitive is not hooked up to Blackboard and it doesn't show a grade, call me or text me or email me and let me know so I can enter it. And I want you guys to be safe and pray for peace. So that's it for this week. Take care now. Bye-bye.